Story 1. During the summer break of my junior year of high school, I landed a night shift job at a McDonald's on the outskirts of town. I was 17, desperate to build up my college fund since my parents hadn't planned for it. Without money, college might have been off the table altogether. I figured working nights wouldn't be too hard. I could make some extra cash while also squeezing in time to do homework or even catch a little sleep if the night was slow. Fast food was at the top of my job list. I loved burgers and fries, and when McDonald's called back with an offer, it felt like a no-brainer. The location was a little eerie, just off the highway, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. But I didn't care as long as I got paid. Besides, I figured working in such an isolated place would mean fewer customers, giving me some downtime. That first night, I borrowed my dad's old car and drove to the restaurant. When I arrived, I noticed the building looked worn. The walls had patches of mold creeping along the corners, and the flickering lights above the parking lot made everything feel a little too quiet. But I brushed it off. A job's a job. Inside, I was greeted by a middle-aged man with tired eyes. He gave me a quick tour, showing me the equipment, how to manage orders, and where everything was kept. He was friendly enough, but there was something about him that felt off. After the tour, he paused by the counter and gave me a serious look. "Hey kid, do you believe in ghosts?" I chuckled nervously. "Not really." "Why?" He took a deep breath, and what he said next made my skin crawl. "Listen, this place, it's different. There are things you need to know. There are rules. You follow them, or you won't last the night." At first, I thought he was messing with me. Maybe a hazing ritual for new employees. But then he pulled out his phone and showed me photos of teenagers who used to work there. "They didn't follow the rules," he whispered, his voice shaky, "and now they're gone." "Did you report it to the police?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. He shook his head. "The cops think I'm crazy. Please just follow the rules. Take them seriously." Before I could ask more, he handed me a folded sheet of paper. It looked worn, as if it had been read 100 times over. "This could save your life," he said before leaving me alone in the building. With a sigh, I flattened the paper and started reading. "Keep the lights on at the drive-through counter at all times. The only exception is rule number 5. There's something waiting in the dark. It's patient, but it'll strike if the lights go out. If a black Range Rover with tinted windows pulls up, do not engage. Don't speak, no matter what the driver says. He will curse, threaten, and demand service. Ignore him. If you respond, he'll break into the booth, and you won't survive. Never open a bag of frozen fries after midnight. The scent will attract things you don't want to meet. If you hear your name called from behind you, do not turn around. Lay flat on the ground, close your eyes, and stay still. You may feel claws or teeth brushing against you, but don't react. It'll leave once it's done, if you don't move. If a 5-year-old girl with empty eye sockets appears on the camera, turn off the lights and lock everything immediately. Stay quiet until the screaming and scratching stop. When it's over, you can turn the lights back on. If you hear voices in the dining area, don't investigate. The building is locked. There's no one inside. It's a trick. Ignore it. If the lights go out on their own, sever a toe or finger and place it on the counter. If the lights come back on and the limb is gone, you're safe. If it's still there, pray for a quick death. Do not fall asleep. If you do, you may miss your name being called or the little girl appearing, and that'll be the end of you. The rules were absurd. I almost laughed. But then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the bushes by the drive-through lane. Something about the way the shadows shifted made my stomach drop. Suddenly, following the rules didn't seem so silly. The first hour was uneventful. No customers, no strange occurrences. I began to relax, thinking maybe the whole thing had been an elaborate joke. But then I saw her. A little girl appeared on the camera, standing perfectly still by the driveway. Her eye sockets were hollow, black holes where her eyes should have been. I froze, paralyzed by fear, until I remembered rule number 5. With shaking hands, I shut off the lights and ducked under the counter. Seconds later, something slammed against the booth, hard enough to rattle the walls. Then came the screams, piercing, inhuman wails that grew louder and louder until I thought my eardrums would burst. I covered my ears, praying for it to end, and just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I waited a full minute before turning the lights back on. The lot was empty, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Later, a black Range Rover pulled into the drive-thru. The driver barked his order, cursing when I didn't respond. I kept silent, heart pounding in my chest. Eventually, he sped off, tires screeching. By the end of my shift, I was a wreck. I wanted to quit right then and there, but the manager, the same man from earlier, begged me to stay. He even offered to double my pay. "Please," when he said, "you're good at this." I thought about the little girl, the screaming, the Range Rover. Was $200 a night really worth it? I still haven't decided, but one thing's for sure. I'll never look at a McDonald's the same way again. Story 2, I never use my turn signal. There's no way to say that without sounding like an asshole, I know. But it's the truth. I haven't touched that lever in 6 months, not since the day it all started. It was late afternoon when it happened, the sun hanging low on the horizon, casting everything in that orange glow that feels both peaceful and unsettling. I was cursing my boss under my breath for keeping me late again, but the only silver lining was missing rush hour. The highway was nearly empty, which suited me just fine. That's when I first saw the car. It appeared behind me so suddenly that I thought I must have spaced out. 1 second the road was clear, the next this beat-up thing was trailing behind me. The front license plate was missing, the windshield cracked, and the hood seemed to be held down by duct tape. I couldn't see the driver clearly. It looked like a man, but the shadows inside the car were too deep to make out his features. I brushed it off and kept driving, humming along with the radio to some mindless pop song. I was on my way to visit my parents for the weekend, a long, boring drive out to the middle of nowhere, and I had already started mentally listing everything I'd do when I got there. After about 2 hours, I reached my exit. I turned on my signal out of habit, switched lanes, and headed toward the ramp. That's when I noticed it. The car behind me took the same exit. A flicker of unease wormed into my gut. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But as I made another turn, this time right, the car followed. My heart kicked up a notch. I tried to stay calm. "It's just a random car going the same way," I muttered. "Relax. You're being paranoid." I turned off the radio, suddenly hyper-aware of every sound around me. The hum of my tires on the asphalt, the low rumble of the car trailing behind me. I took the next gravel road, winding through the narrow back roads that would eventually lead to my parents' house. And the car followed. That's when I started to panic. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat, fumbling to call my dad. Maybe he could meet me at the door with his old shotgun. But the screen flashed. No service. "Come on," I whispered, frantically tapping at the phone. I tried calling 911. Same result, no signal. I looked back at the road just in time to see my turn coming up. I slammed on the brakes and swerved hard to the right, the car skidding across the loose gravel. My heart pounded as I wrestled the wheel, barely managing to stay out of the ditch. The car behind me made the turn effortlessly. It was still there. I was only 10 minutes from home. If I could just make it a few more miles. That's when my car sputtered and slowed. No, I muttered, jamming my foot down on the gas pedal. Nothing. The engine coughed, groaned, and then died completely. I twisted the key in the ignition over and over again, but the engine wouldn't catch. My car was dead, and so was my chance of getting away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the car behind me flash its headlights. Once. Twice. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't tell if it was anger or fear, but a wave of something hot and overwhelming surged through me. For a moment, I thought about getting out, storming up to the other driver, and demanding to know what the hell they wanted. But I was frozen. What if they were dangerous? Then I remembered the shovel in my trunk. I'd left it there after helping out at a community garden the week before. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I hit the trunk release and pushed my door open, keeping my eyes locked on the car behind me. As I stepped out, the driver's door opened too. A man emerged, tall and slim, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. But what struck me most was how he stood, perfectly still, facing away from me. I hesitated, then took a step toward the trunk. The gravel crunched under my foot, loud in the quiet evening air. The man didn't move. I yanked the trunk open and grabbed the shovel, my hands slick with sweat. When I slammed the trunk shut and turned around, my stomach dropped. He was closer. I hadn't heard him move. Not a single footstep. But now he stood just a few feet from me, still facing away, head tilted ever so slightly as if listening. My pulse roared in my ears. Slowly, I backed toward the driver's seat, gripping the shovel like a lifeline. I reached the door, threw myself inside and locked it. That's when he turned. His face, or what was left of it, was a nightmare. Skin peeled away in ribbons, exposing raw, mangled flesh. Blood dripped from what should have been his nose and mouth, and his hollow eyes seemed to stare right through me. I scrambled across to the passenger seat, pressing myself against the door as he reached for the handle. The lock held. For a moment, we stared at each other. Then he started to bash his head against the window. The sound was horrifying, wet, crunching thuds as blood smeared across the glass. I screamed, twisting the key in the ignition one last time. The engine roared to life. I floored it. The tires spun on the gravel before catching, and I shot forward, leaving the man and his shattered face behind. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing motionless in the road, facing away once again. I didn't stop driving until I reached my parents' house. They thought I'd hit a deer. They didn't believe a word of my story. No one did. Since that night, I've seen his car a few times. Always when I'm alone, always when I least expect it. I've learned to outrun him, but I don't take any chances anymore. I don't use my turn signal. Not ever, because I know he's out there, waiting. Story 3. A couple of nights ago, I was sitting alone at my kitchen counter, scrolling aimlessly through social media on my laptop. It was another quiet, uneventful weekend, the kind I usually spend alone. I've never been much of a social butterfly, which explains why I'm still single in my early 30s. And honestly, I don't mind it that way. I glanced at the clock on the microwave. 10 p.m., time to get ready for bed. Just as I was about to close my laptop, a sharp knock at the front door startled me so badly I almost spilled my tea. XPD, we're here answering an emergency call from this residence. Please open the door. What? An emergency call? I hadn't called anyone. Heart racing, I got up and went to the front door, pulling it open just enough to see 2 police officers standing outside. Good evening, ma'am, the first officer said with a slight smile. I'm Officer Blythe, and this is my partner, Officer Duchamp. I glanced at their uniforms. Sure enough, their names were stitched into the tags, Rainer Blythe and Greg Duchamp. We received a call from this address, Blythe continued. A woman reported hearing the sound of a large animal crawling on the second floor while she was downstairs. Are you alone in the house tonight? I blinked, confused. Yes, I live alone. And I didn't make any call. Are you sure you've got the right address? Officer Duchamp glanced down at a small notepad in his hand. Is this 4444 Street? I nodded. Yes, but there must be a mistake. I didn't hear anything unusual. And there's no one else here. The 2 officers exchanged a quick glance, and then Blythe gave me a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, ma'am, we'd better take a look just to be sure, he said, half joking. It's possible you've got some unwelcome company lurking upstairs. Something about the way he said it unsettled me, but I found myself stepping aside and letting them in. Maybe it was the way the darkness outside pressed against the porch lights, making the idea of 2 officers checking the house seem like a good one. Relax, Duchamp added as they crossed the threshold. It's probably nothing. Maybe the caller got the wrong address. I followed them as they made their way up the stairs, turning on all the lights as we went. They moved with an air of ease, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. Flashlights in hand, they checked the bedrooms, peered under the beds, even opened closets and windows. Nothing here, Blythe said at last, switching off his flashlight with a click. Told you, probably just a mix-up. They didn't seem concerned, but as they headed for the front door, I felt a gnawing discomfort I couldn't shake. I stood on the porch, watching them walk off into the night, their figures dissolving into the shadows. That's when I noticed something strange. There was no squad car, and as I strained to listen, I didn't hear an engine start or see headlights flare. Nothing. just the sound of the wind stirring the leaves on the street. I closed the door and locked it, a knot tightening in my stomach. Something was off. Back at the kitchen counter, I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept circling back to the officers, their slightly disheveled uniforms, the odd familiarity in the way they exchanged glances, the missing patrol car, and the emergency call. Who had made it? I opened my laptop and typed their names into the search bar. Almost immediately, an article popped up, a 5-year-old blog post. Where did officers Rainer Blythe and Greg Duchamp go after answering their final call? I clicked on it, my pulse quickening. The article described how the two officers had disappeared 9 years ago after responding to an emergency call at a remote house, my house. A chill ran down my spine as I read on. According to the article, the original call came from a woman named Lori Randall, who had lived in the house before it was rebuilt. She'd reported hearing something crawling on the second floor. When the officers arrived, they found a blood trail leading up the stairs. It seemed like an animal had entered the house, dragging something with it, but the trail abruptly stopped halfway down the stairs and turned back. The officers had followed the trail into the upstairs bathroom, only to find the window open and the blood continuing across the exterior wall, not up or down, but horizontally, as if the thing had crawled along the side of the house. The story ended abruptly. Both officers and Lori vanished that night. No bodies were ever found. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it a prank? An urban legend? It had to be, right? And yet everything matched. The address, the officers' names, the strange call. I forced myself to shake it off. It was late, and my imagination was running wild. I turned off the lights and went upstairs to bed, telling myself I'd call the police in the morning to confirm the officer's visit. But sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was broken by a sharp, frantic voice outside my house. "Oh God, please, there's blood everywhere. Please send help. It's crawling. It's on the stairs." I shot up in bed, heart hammering. I scrambled to the window, but I couldn't see anyone from my vantage point. Only the eerie glow of the porch light. Then, as quickly as it began, the shouting stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the screams. My breath hitched and a cold realization settled over me. It was happening again. I crept down the stairs, every nerve in my body screaming to stay quiet. As I reached the bottom step, I froze. The front door was ajar, and standing just inside was a woman. Her throat was torn open, her eyes vacant, her body a mangled mess of blood and shredded flesh. She didn't move, at least not at first. Then slowly she dropped to all fours and began to crawl up the stairs, leaving a slick trail of blood behind her. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled backward into the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the counter. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Then I heard it, a sharp knock at the door, followed by a familiar voice. "Police, open up. It's Officers Blythe and Duchamp. You already know us, ma'am." My blood ran cold as they started pounding on the door. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I bolted for the back door, leaving the house and everything in it behind. As I ran through the woods toward the nearest gas station, I could hear them calling out behind me, their voices carrying through the dark like a twisted game of hide and seek. "We'll find you, ma'am. It's only a matter of time." And somewhere, deeper in the woods, I swear I could hear the sound of something crawling. Story 4. I live in a rural part of central Texas, tucked down a dirt road a few miles off the highway. It's quiet country, 40 acres of pasture, mostly for grazing cattle. My nearest neighbor, Bill, lives about a mile away, and past his property, the road dips into a stretch of woods. A mile further, you'll find a solid concrete bridge with metal culverts crossing over a narrow creek. That's where it happened. It was last week. I'd been feeling restless, so I decided to take a walk along the road to clear my head. Even in October, the heat was relentless, pushing 90 degrees, and the land was parched from a month without rain. When I reached the bridge, I hopped the guardrail and climbed down into the dry creek bed to explore. A small trickle of water wound through the center, the only hint of life in an otherwise cracked and bone-dry channel. The creek was shaded by old oaks and sycamores, their branches tangling into a canopy overhead. Brush lined the banks, and exposed roots curled out from the walls, snaking between brittle ferns and dried plants. I walked upstream, letting the stillness settle over me. No traffic, no distractions, just the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I could feel the tension melting away with every step. About a mile from the bridge, I rounded a bend and saw something up ahead. A buck standing by the thin stream. It was massive with broad antlers, easily 4 or 5 years old. I froze, not wanting to spook it, and slowly reached into my pocket for my phone. I figured I'd snap a quick picture. Zooming in, I adjusted the focus, marveling at the buck's powerful build. That's when I saw it. Instead of the white muzzle I expected, I saw red. My stomach twisted as I realized the buck wasn't drinking water. It was chewing. Hanging from its sharp, uneven teeth were pieces of sinew and flesh. Beneath the animal, the mangled body of a bobcat lay half-eaten. The sight stunned me, my brain scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. Deer don't eat meat, at least not like this. As I stared, trying to rationalize the impossible, my foot shifted, snapping a twig beneath me. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence. The buck's head jerked up, its black, glassy eyes locking onto mine. And then, slowly, it stood. Not on 4 legs, on 2. It rose upright, towering over me, its sinewy limbs bending awkwardly as it balanced on its hind legs. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it took a step toward me. I ran. I don't remember making the decision to flee. My body acted on instinct. My lungs burned as I sprinted downstream, feet slipping on roots and loose rocks. Behind me, a shriek pierced the air, high-pitched like a woman screaming, then twisting into a deep, guttural roar. I glanced back just for a second, and my foot snagged on a root. I hit the ground hard, scraping my arm along the clay and knocking the wind out of me. Panicking, I scrambled to my feet, expecting to see the creature closing in. But the creek behind me was empty. The only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't wait. I kept running, legs pumping beneath me, fear dragging me forward. When I reached the bridge, I heard something strange. Laughter, deep and raspy, drifting from the woods. It sounded almost like coyotes, but slower, more deliberate, as if they were mocking me. I hauled myself up onto the bridge, banging my head against the guardrail in my haste. Pain shot through my skull, but I didn't stop. I sprinted the rest of the way home, bursting through the front door and locking it behind me. Only then, when I was safely inside, did I let the adrenaline drain away, my body collapsing in exhaustion. That was a week ago. Every night since, I've woken up in the middle of the night to the same thing, a voice whispering my name. At first, I thought it was just the aftershock of what I'd seen, my brain playing tricks on me. But every time I get up and look out the window, I see it. A dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line, just barely visible in the moonlight. And every time I hear that same horrible laughter, it's closer now. Story 5. Back in college, the Student Activities Council hired a well-known ghost hunter to speak on campus. I'd always been fascinated by the paranormal, so I left my skeptical boyfriend behind in his dorm and hurried over to the auditorium. I wasn't about to miss this. The ghost hunter wasn't someone I recognized, but he had a long list of credentials and seemed to have some projects in the works. This was back in 2005. He might even have a TV show by now. He was a small man with a white professor-like beard and a receding hairline, but his stories about the afterlife were captivating. Whether he truly believed in what he talked about or was just that good of a salesman, I couldn't tell, but he had us all hanging on every word. He showed us video clips from his investigations, creepy photos, and told tales of hauntings. One story that stuck with me was about a cursed doll someone found at a flea market. It supposedly moved around on its own, but only when no one was looking. At the end of his talk, he opened the floor for questions. Predictably, there were plenty of dumb ones. Ever seen someone's head spin like The Exorcist? But a few were thoughtful. I couldn't resist the chance to ask something myself. When he scanned the room, his eyes landed on me. Yes, you. The girl in the white shirt. I felt a bit nervous as I spoke. Hi, I was wondering, What's the scariest experience you've had as a ghost hunter? The moment the words left my mouth, I saw his expression shift. The easy confidence faded, replaced by something harder to pin down. For a second, I thought I'd seen a flicker of fear. He forced a small, tight-lipped smile. "Well, there are a lot of frightening moments in my line of work," he said, chuckling lightly, though the laughter didn't quite reach his eyes. "They pop up more often than you'd think." The audience gave a polite laugh, but I felt like I'd made a mistake asking that question. He went on to tell a story about investigating an abandoned elementary school and how his flashlight stopped working. A pretty tame tale, especially for someone who chases ghosts for a living. The Q&A wrapped up and the students started filtering toward the exits. I stayed behind, feeling awkward and a little embarrassed. Maybe I'd asked something I shouldn't have. As the crowd thinned, I decided to take the side door to avoid getting caught in the rush. To my surprise, the ghost hunter was sitting on a bench outside, near the bike racks, lighting a cigarette. I kept my head down, hoping to pass by unnoticed, but his voice stopped me. "Hey, kid!" I froze, guilt washing over me. I turned around slowly, muttering, "Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ask a dumb question." He waved off my apology and gestured to the bench. "It wasn't a dumb question. Sit with me for a minute." I hesitated. Every lesson on stranger danger flashed through my mind, but something in his weary demeanor made me trust him. I sat down, keeping some distance between us. After a deep drag from his cigarette, he exhaled slowly, staring off into the night. "I didn't tell the truth back there," he admitted, his voice quieter, the showman's mask gone. "That wasn't the scariest moment of my career." I nodded. "I thought as much." He gave me a small, humorless smile. "Yeah, you're sharp." He tapped his cigarette, scattering the ashes onto the cement. "You want to know what really scared me?" I swallowed, unsure if I did, but I nodded anyway. "It was the 70s, he began. "Back then, I wasn't anyone special. Just a young guy chasing whatever paranormal cases the big names didn't want. Most of the time, it was nothing. People hearing their pipes groan, kids playing pranks. But one case stood out. The family that called him sounded desperate. Their teenage son, they claimed, had been possessed. At first, he'd just acted strange, withdrawn and moody. But then things escalated. He'd tried to assault a female cousin, and they'd sent her away, too terrified to let her stay in the house. The ghost hunter thought it was just a case of a troubled teen, but he brought everything with him. Holy water, sage, even a small handgun, just in case. "The moment I arrived at their Victorian house," he said, "everything went quiet. The activity they'd reported, the voices, the moving objects, it all stopped. I spent 2 weeks investigating that house. 2 weeks, and not a single thing happened." He sighed. "I thought I'd wasted my time." There was, however, one thing he couldn't explain. The basement. It was immaculate, like the rest of the house, he said, but the basement had 4 large drains set into the concrete floor. Drains that didn't make sense for a residential home. On his last night there, after the parents had taken their son to a city clinic, he stayed behind to finish writing his report, and that's when it happened. "It started as a small sound," he said, voice dropping to a near whisper, like footsteps, but not walking, more like something coming. He stared at the pavement as if reliving the moment. It had no face, no eyes, but I knew it was looking at me, looking through me. He paused, cigarette trembling between his fingers. Then it spoke. I didn't hear it exactly. It was like the words were just, there. He turned to me, eyes heavy with the memory. "You know what he did to us," it said. I felt a chill run down my spine. "I ran," he confessed, voice filled with regret. "Left my notes, the family, everything. I never went back." Later, curiosity gnawed at him. He learned that the house had once belonged to a mortician, a man with dark secrets. "The drains," the ghost hunter whispered. "They weren't just for water, and whatever that thing was, it knew." He crushed his cigarette underfoot, the embers glowing briefly before snuffing out. "That's the scariest moment of my career," he said quietly, "because now I know." I sat in a stunned silence, unsure what to say. Eventually, I managed a quiet, "Thank you." He nodded, stood, and walked away, disappearing into the night. Years later, I moved into a new place with my fiancé. I found an old drain in the basement, just like the one he described, and now every night I lie awake, listening, because I know, and I'm terrified. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.